Fashion in the 1960s was characterized by pastel suits with short boxy jackets, pillbox hats, and geometric-shaped dresses, which were the iconic fashion of First Lady Mrs. Kennedy. During the middle part of the decade, fashion was associated with mini skirts, shirts, and dresses, which are the iconic view of Twiggy. In the last part of the decade, fashion went to what we know today as the hippie style, with frayed bell-bottom jeans, tie-dye t-shirts, headbands, and sandals. The major cars created in the 1960s were the Chevy Cobra and the Ford Mustang, as well as the Chevy Corvette and Stingray. Major athletes of this decade were Wilt Chamberlain with basketball and Muhammad Ali with boxing. A major event in sports in this decade was the first televised Olympic Games, which were a major accomplishment. Major technological inventions of this decade were the invention of the microwave, the 8-track tape, and the birth of the Internet. Another major accomplishment coming out of this decade was the space race.
The TV debate, Nixon versus Kennedy, 1960. Dwight Eisenhower became the first presidential candidate to successfully use the television medium to campaign. John Kennedy perfected it. The Kennedy campaign knew how to use the medium to full effect, while his opponent did not. During their first televised debate, Kennedy looked rested, tanned, and wore makeup. Vice President Nixon refused the makeup and was recovering from an illness which made him look pasty. Additionally, Nixon wore a 5 o'clock shadow, which accentuated his features and made him appear devious. Radio listeners thought Nixon won the debate. The TV watchers thought Kennedy won. The Berlin Wall, 1961. Millions of people escaped the Eastern Bloc through Berlin. By 1961, the Soviets and East Germans had enough. In order to prevent further escape and to keep the professional classes trapped, they built a wall. The Berlin Wall became a symbol of communist oppression and propaganda tool for the West. At the same time, it lessened tensions between the two Cold War foes. At one point before the wall, the two sides pointed tanks at each other in the streets of Berlin. Following its construction, John Kennedy visited the wall and let the Berliners know the free world stood with them. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. In October 1962, the United States caught the Soviet Union building nuclear installations on Cuba. President Kennedy ordered a blockade. The world stood on the principle of annihilation. Meanwhile, Robert Kennedy worked behind the scenes to secure a peaceful end of the crisis. In the end, Kennedy cut a deal with the Soviets. The U.S. pulled its offensive and outdated missiles out of Turkey, while the Soviets would pull out of Cuba. However, the Soviets could not disclose the deal. March on Washington, 1963. The Civil Rights Movement culminated with the March on Washington in August 1963. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech to 250,000 people. Following the march, the Civil Rights Movement continued on and grew increasingly radical as its members tired of the violence. JFK assassination, 1963. In November 1963, John Kennedy made a campaign swing through Texas. On November 22, 1963, he visited Dallas and was assassinated. The national tragedy ushered in 20 years of shocks to America. The assassination continues to elicit controversy. The Tet Offensive, 1968. The Johnson administration promised the United States was winning the Vietnam War. On January 31, 1968, the enemy launched a massive offensive. They attacked every major city in South Vietnam and focused on command and control centers. The offensive appeared on American television. That is what the communist commanders wanted. They hoped to influence American public opinion to get them to abandon the war. That part of the plan worked. Militarily, it was a disaster for North Vietnam. They were thoroughly defeated. However, Americans did not know this. They only saw blood on the television and felt the administration lied to them. America could not win the war now because of this credibility gap and because Americans did not understand war. MLK assassination, 1968. On April 4, 1968, an assassin murdered Martin Luther King Jr. King predicted his death on more than one occasion. The night before, he gave his last address during a violent thunderstorm. The "I've been to the mountaintop" address evoked a comparison with Moses, who saw the promised land and passed away before reaching it. King died the next day. The Democratic National Convention, 1968. Protesters filled the streets of Chicago for the convention. Chicago's Mayor Daley ran the city with his iron fist. He authorized the use of force. The police clashed with protesters. The disorder appeared on television across the world. An investigation called it a police riot. Although the police used excessive force, the protesters were more than willing to engage in violence and used weapons as well. Violence even spread to the convention floor. Newsman Dan Rather was beat up by a protester. The violence contrasted dramatically to the Republican convention. To the average voter, Richard Nixon represented law and order while the Democrats brought chaos. Moon landing, 1969. On July 20, 1969, a man landed on the moon. The event represented the apex of human technological development. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first two to walk on the lunar surface, while Michael Collins orbited the moon. Several moon landings followed. Since 1972, no one has returned. The world has lost nearly 40 years dawdling over the space program.